Middle-class people in the 1970s didn't always have the funds for fine dining, but that doesn't mean they didn't enjoy some of the best food on a budget. Let's go through a classic weekly menu for homes in the 1970s. So, one thing that was pretty popular in the 1970s was Eggs Benedict. It was basically just this egg-based dish that had them poached instead of fried or boiled. Eggs Benedict would usually be paired up with Canadian bacon and an English muffin. The real key that brought it all together was the hollandaise sauce, and it sounds fancier than it is because it was not that expensive to make. The things it did for the dish were extraordinary, though. It took it from a 7 to a straight 10, which is why this was such a popular lunch option both in restaurants and for home chefs. Another way to have Eggs Benedict was to pair it alongside strips of chicken as well. This dish definitely has stood the test of time, since even though it was pretty popular in the 70s, it still gets some motion today. The next thing we have on the list is pork and beans, which is a homely and simple dish that gets your spirits right back up. Cuts of pork were finally becoming more affordable since the dust from the recession was settling and people could start eating like they used to, and that meant bringing back their favorite cuts of meat. This was pork served and cooked with beans, which you would usually have with bread. Not only was it delicious, but it was also common because it was quite healthy. You had all your carb and protein needs in one simple dish. On top of that, it was really easy to make since all you needed were some canned beans. The dish itself would barely take half an hour, and it was a pretty ordinary lunch or dinner back in those days. Goulash was something you would see fairly often if you were from the Midwest, but even if you were just visiting for a few days, it was a dish you could not really escape around there. Lots of people would recommend you try street-style goulash or order it when you were visiting a restaurant. Plus, if you had any family or friends living in Midwest areas, you would definitely get served this at one of their homes. The dish itself has the nutritional benefits of pork and beans, but it has a lot more of an explosive taste. We can thank the mix of macaroni, tomato sauce, and ground beef for that. Once you bring those together in a goulash, it creates a symphony of flavors that people just adored back in the day. Shirred eggs are something we bet you have not heard of before. If you have, then you must have been from the Midwest, Louisiana, or the northern areas of New York. This is because Franco-American communities were most commonplace in those areas, and this is a dish of French origin. It takes your taste buds and brain for a spin, since we bet you are not used to the idea of baked eggs. In the 70s, though, this was all the rage. These were eggs that would be baked in a flat-bottomed dish, and not only were these a trend of the 70s, they had been popular since the Victorian era. Talk about vintage, right? While the word baked might evoke thoughts of a muffin-like texture, it's more accurate to think of an egg custard. These eggs were baked in a bath of cream that made the white and the yolk pretty thick, and we have to say it looks like something worth trying. Stuffed mushrooms were these mushroom caps that had a mixture of several fillings to add variety to your diet for the week and give you a whirlwind of flavors to think about post-meal. We are talking about American favorites like herbs, sausages, breadcrumbs, and of course, natural fresh mushrooms. A variety of cheeses would be used too, from goat's cheese to ricotta depending on how far you were willing to take the dish. Most restaurants stuck to goat's cheese, but if all you had on you was Parmesan, then it would work just fine. As for the mushrooms, portobello mushrooms were non-negotiable as they were the heart and soul of the dish. Then you had your usual stuff like pine nuts, sun-dried tomatoes, and roasted red peppers. It sounds like an incredibly savory dish that would set your taste buds on fire. So the history behind mulligatawny soup actually dates back to our colonial days when America was still under British rule. The story goes something like this. British officers and VIPs would constantly request this soup as their first course, which mostly has Indian origins. Originally, the soup was a pretty thin one, but to suit their taste palates, it was thickened up with vegetables and meat. That was all during the 18th century, and if we skip forward to the 1970s, this was already in cookbooks around the nation. It took on another form entirely different from its roots, and it started to look more like a curry soup with chicken, vegetables, apples, and rice. Those are ingredients that the average American is not familiar with in their soup, but if you are open to trying, you might be very surprised. Cucumber sandwiches were a really light meal that was a popular option for people who were trying to get that picture-perfect body or just make some healthier lifestyle changes to their diet. Now, obviously, health does not mean treating food like fuel and not like the comforting experience it can be, so people had to innovate a little with their plates. What that leads to is stuff like cucumber sandwiches becoming more popular. Sandwiches like this just involved simple cucumber slices on white or brown bread with butter and/or cream cheese to add a bit of a kick to an otherwise slightly boring combo. It really did click, though, and we definitely did not imagine cream cheese and cucumbers could be such a combo. Though it is not something you would find very often today in diet plans, we are curious if you have ever tried something like this. Let us know down below. Pheasant Underglass was one of those delights of the 70s that people went out to restaurants for, and tourists regularly put on their to-do list. Not just them. Restaurants would make it a point to constantly brush up their pheasant cooking skills because of how often this dish would be ordered. Think of it like how popular Peking duck was in the 19th century, and this is not too far off from that. It is just a pheasant breast that has been cooked with mushrooms and is served under a glass dome, hence the name. Some places cook it with shallots in a wine sauce reduction, while others use a full pheasant for flair and glamour. It is a cultural icon in many parts of America, despite its popularity going down a bit over the years. Potato pancakes, also known as latkes, were an incredibly trendy breakfast option that dominated the tables of most households for a long while. As with many things in the 1900s, this also had its roots in the Great Depression. Back then, as you might have remembered when we were talking about pork and beans, it was pretty hard to afford any kind of protein or most vegetables. What was easy to buy and grow yourself, however, was potatoes. With increased farming capabilities and creative ingenuity, an entire variety of potato-based dishes became widely adopted across the nation. You just need to grate your potatoes and shape them into pancakes, then fry until golden brown. Typically, these would get served with honey or applesauce or even sour cream. Plus, it took two of America's top comfort options and fused them together, so it makes sense that it lasted a long while after the recession itself ended. Coddled eggs, on the other hand, were something exclusive to the 70s, and not an egg dish you would see very often these days. They were made by placing eggs in hot water and cooking them, but you had to be very gentle or you could mess up the whole dish. If you wanted true perfection, then you would need to get special egg coddlers. These were porcelain cups with lids, specifically designed for cooking food in a boiling water bath. While they had other uses besides making coddled eggs, they were exclusively made for the dish. Having a whole utensil made just for you is a flex some other names on this list cannot claim, so that definitely adds to the wow factor here. The highlight of this dish was how the whites would be firm, but the yolk would be soft and runny, and it led to a really nice texture. Celery and olive salad was a healthy salad that you could eat without any worries if you were trying to watch your calories and your health in general. It was made with sliced celery, some olives, either green or black work, and a light vinaigrette. White wine vinegar, dried apricots, and dates made the dish something that would tick off every nutritional concern you had while still being something you did not have to force yourself to eat. It had a good crunchy texture to it, which helped a lot of people get into the dish more easily than other salads. If you really wanted to make it more familiar, you could also add chicken bits to the dish and it would work just fine. In concept, it was more like ingredients of a burger placed in a salad, minus all the oil and cheese and ground beef. Unfortunately, we have come a pretty long way with expanding our salad options as a country, so things like this got left behind. Grape jelly meatballs are something you will not hear about today at all. Sauces today tend to lean a lot more towards the savory side of things, having all kinds of spices in them. Even the sweet and tangy ones like buffalo sauce taste wildly different from this, so the culinary trends of the country took a sharp turn away from grape jelly sauce. However, back in the 70s, cooking your meatballs in this was a pretty common idea that spread like wildfire. People were tired of the old spaghetti and meatball combo they had been eating for years and years, but it was not like they wanted to let go of the iconic dish entirely. What is an American without their meatballs after all? Hence, they came up with the idea of cooking them in a grape jelly sauce for a completely different flavor profile, and it worked pretty well in the 70s, though we are not sure how this dish would fare today. Chicken cacciatore was an Italian-American dish that made all the waves during the 70s when it first started getting some serious traction. This movement started in neighborhoods like Daphne in Alabama or Scottsdale, North Phoenix in Arizona. It slowly started spreading to bigger states like California, where restaurants in both middle-class and upper-class areas like the Excelsior District would often serve it in restaurants. It was prepared using onions, peppers, and sometimes wine, but the key was that really tangy tomato sauce. The name translates to hunter's chicken, a reference to its traditional preparation with wild game during the 16th century, particularly in the Renaissance. You would need 2 3-pound whole chickens though, so this was a dish that people would reserve for special occasions when they could go all out on the food. Let's step away a little bit from the meat-only dishes and go into some stews, which are a delicacy in all kinds of middle-class families. Stews were a popular option across America for many years, with beef bourguignon being one of the most beloved varieties. This was another thing that was deeply beloved by French Americans all across America, and it makes sense given its French origins. Made with beef that was braised in a red wine sauce, as well as beef stock, wild mushrooms, and onions, this was a pretty hearty stew with an explosive arrangement of flavors. If you were never a stew fan before, this could convert you into one pretty easily. We know the name is a mouthful, and it does not have the same love or popularity today that it did back then. But do not pass up a chance to try this if it ever comes by. Richard Gay may have been the first one to use the term Frogmore Stew, but the dish itself was a South Carolina classic. This dish had several variations out way before he would think of a name for the dish in the 1960s. An icon of low country cuisine and something the middle class adored, it was a one-pot meal made of shrimp, corn on the cob, smoked sausage, and sweet potatoes. These were the 4 basic ingredients, but sometimes you could swap out the sweet potatoes for regular ones. People would also add live blue crab or stone crab claws and onions as well. A combination of ingredients like this is not something you see today anymore, especially literal crab claws. Admit it though, it does make you curious as to what this tastes like, right? Unfortunately, it has become increasingly difficult to find a place that makes authentic Frogmore stew, as the dish has largely faded in popularity. Brunswick Stew was a tomato-based dish that included locally sourced beans, vegetables, and small game, such as squirrels or rabbits. Today, it typically includes larger cuts of protein, such as beef or pulled pork, but the original 1970s version was much simpler. Despite the lack of larger proteins, the stew still had a vibrant flavor that was unmistakable. The lima beans, corn, and tomatoes were the perfect combo to bring the slightly more hidden notes of the dish to life. Plus, it was really cheap to make, and it did not take a lot of time either, which for stews is pretty amazing. Most stews take up either your entire day or half your wallet if you are trying to have one with some actual personality. This was oozing with character though, and a lot more. What we cannot figure out is why such a reliable option faded into history along the way. Pot roasts are not exclusively enjoyed by the middle class, as people from presidents to everyday citizens have fond memories of this dish. However, pot roasts became a common Thanksgiving tradition across the nation. Not just Thanksgiving, it was pretty common as a weekend meal or a Christmas one too. Point being, the holidays were never complete without a good pot roast. If you've never had one, pot roasts are essentially slow-cooked beef roasts served with a thick, creamy gravy. It's surprising given that they remain fairly popular today. Vegetables like onions, tomatoes, and peppers would also be there, though each family had its own variation on what they would put in. Either way, you have to try pot roasts at least once in your life if you never have. Speaking of slow-cooked, let's talk about baked beans and the sweet, tangy sauces they would come with. These were mostly a side dish and not the main attraction, but that worked out much better for them too. As a main dish, it would be a little lacking, but as a side, it is the perfect partner to barbecues and cookouts across the country. It really does elevate whatever you put next to it, especially steaks. These would require a technique called parboiling, which was basically just partly cooking the vegetables instead of going all the way. While you can still find baked beans, this method of preparation is something that was lost with the 70s. The tamale pie has its inspirations and roots in a traditional Mexican dish known as a tamale, which is a little different from the pie version we have come to know and love. The earliest form of the pie, which ruled over middle-class families' menus, was a casserole that involved beef in a chili sauce between 2 layers of cornmeal mush. This dish had a very guns-blazing philosophy behind it, which kind of makes sense given how the 70s is known for nothing but flashiness and going the extra mile. People started adding things like olives, green peppers, and cheese, and at one point even marshmallows were thrown in. You would not find a tamale pie unless you were in Mexican neighborhoods today, but back then it was all the rage. Creamed chipped beef on toast is a pretty calming dish to end this list on, which has otherwise been filled with food that would put you in a coma. Still, everyone needs a good breakfast option to rely on, and nothing really came close to creamed chipped beef in that regard. Dried beef served with a quick and easy creamy sauce over some toast spoke on a spiritual level to Americans in the 70s. And since all of this was pretty affordable, it was a breakfast you could eat without any worries. It is something you would still see today, but it has taken a step down from the days where this was what literally everyone was eating. Have you ever tried chipped beef yourself? Now, how is that for a roundup of some of the best foods middle-class families ate in the 70s? Let us know your thoughts. Like, subscribe, and let's keep these memories alive.